Good morning to everybody. Happiness cannot be completely complete. So, we are very happy to have here John C. Brown, and because in the last session of the forum, at the end of the session, Silvia Bravo came to me and said, "Oh, I have an idea for the next." Session of the forum, and her idea was to have John C. Brown here. But I thought, well, this is impossible. For in 1 month we cannot organize this event. But the happy thing was that Emma Kisilova told us that he has to be here in Barcelona. And in a few days, we were very happy that he has said to be here this morning to have a very short presentation because he is living at home. So we have really few time for this presentation. So I am not going to spend more time. The unhappy thing is that we have a very bad day, raining, buses and strikes, so he couldn't arrive before. But just all of you know about him. John C. Brown is very, very well known in the area of e-learning and innovation in this area. So just let us to know his contribution. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, hi. So I thought that I would dash through some images for the first like 30 minutes and then throw it open. And in fact, of the first 30 minutes, 15 minutes, I'm going to flash by just brief images that kind of give you the context of where I'm coming from, and then we'll get into a little bit more content after that, assuming that everything is working here. So I really wanted to discuss a little bit in this kind of 30 minutes, this notion of, is it possible by using open education resources, open courseware, but beyond that, beyond courses, is it possible to think about how we might create more of a culture of learning, more of an entrepreneurial culture, which is why I'm here in Barcelona yesterday, and so on. So the catch is, how do we go beyond just course material? So let me just say, everybody in this room, I think, would agree that what we're trying to look at is how do we go beyond just what you might call a Cartesian view of learning, which basically says, I think, therefore I am. Knowledge is something that you may think about as, pouring into a student's head, and that we all teach our students in the old days how to do this in a very precise disciplinary rows where disciplines don't cross each other and so on and so forth. So this is meant, obviously, to be a caricature. I want to suggest that a much more modern approach toward learning really has to do with what I'm going to call a social view of learning. So instead of saying, I think, therefore I am, perhaps we should say we participate, and through participation with others in the world, we come into being. This actually has deep psychoanalytic roots that I won't bore you with, but I think there's something very deep about the fact that most of us come to understand something by conversing with others about it. In fact, we all know that the best way to learn something is to teach something. How do you take that to the extreme? And I'm not claiming that knowledge is socially constructed. I'm claiming my personal understanding. The way I come to take information provided in a class, I internalize that through conversations often with others, in study groups and so forth. So in fact, this really suggests that real learning is much more kind of chaotic. That is, we learn in and through interactions with each other and with the world in one way or another. And in fact, one of the few really strong results in education theory today, and there aren't that many, really says that there's almost nothing that predicts how well somebody's going to do through college than their ability to form their own study groups. Now, this is a bit problematic for the way some of you have been looking at education, because we're really saying that in building these study groups and working with each other and helping each other learn, actually we learn better ourselves. And the ability to know how to form a study group or how to join a study group is maybe the best single indicator of how well somebody is going to do. And this kind of obviously is a simple extension of the fact that learning is basically social. This is a shot I just took coming through MIT a little while ago. But of course, this notion of study groups can actually happen not just face-to-face, but what we've been finding is that study groups can happen in virtual face-to-face. And one of the most obvious uses of Second Life, this is a shot from Second Life, is how do you actually, in these virtual worlds, build virtual study groups. Now, as you know here, there's a little bit of a problem here, because for study groups to be face-to-face in the virtual land, you still have to be synchronous. And much of what you do is asynchronous, but we might want to think about how do you extend some of the asynchronous ideas to some aspects of this kind of virtual world as well. This is actually a shot from Australia that one of the most interesting ways to look at kind of a form of distributed learning where basically each one of these tables here, study groups can form, and because this is virtual land, any one of these study groups here can lift out and fly off to some other space in the virtual land. But the professor or the teacher or the mentor that's running all this can kind of drop in, can hear what's being said. Any time that a really interesting question comes up in one of these groups, can call everybody back together again, and everybody can hear and see what's going on. So you begin to have another dimension of flexibility with this kind of a scheme. So you almost have the best of both worlds, face-to-face, physical space, and yet being able to split off at a moment's notice and then be able to still be communicating with your mentor who may be at one of these other tables over here, but nevertheless can join you instantly, and so on and so forth. So you can begin to see a lot of experimentation that's going on. These are just two very rough examples of experimentation that are looking at how to kind of use the virtual space, the virtual reality, to create various notions of this. Perhaps, though, one of the most interesting notions, taking the social basis of learning seriously, is to ask the question, how do you use things like Facebook? How do you use things like MySpace? How do you use things like blogs to actually be ways to amplify kind of the social basis of learning? And in fact, it's very interesting. At the University of Michigan a little while ago, where I actually did my doctorate work, and somebody asked me, how many students do you think we teach at the University of Michigan on campus? And I said, well, I happen to know it's around 40,000. They said, no, it's 250,000. I said, how can possibly be 250,000? There's 40,000 students here. They said, no, you don't understand. Every student that now comes to the University of Michigan comes from a village, comes from a town, comes from a community, and they stay connected to that community through Facebook. So that, in fact, there may be 40,000 students on the physical campus. Each one of those students has at least 5 or 10 other people that they stay connected with. And in fact, those other people are part of the social basis of learning. So from this point of view, they were really starting to argue that the educational influence of the University of Michigan was closer to 250,000 students, not 40,000. Now, this was clearly meant to be somewhat of a political argument, and you can appreciate what they're really trying to do is to get more money. But nevertheless, there's something fairly interesting about how do we use social graphs, social nets, and some of the social software to, again, just be a background tool that we might be able to exploit in interesting ways in this form of learning. And perhaps, one of the clearest cut examples of this use of the virtual space to amplify certain types of distance learning, here's a case at Cyber One Law at Harvard, where basically there's a 3-tier system. Tier 1 is you pay a fortune, you pay a lot of money to actually register at the law school. Tier 2 is basically an extended program where you attend all the classes in Second Life, but you have your own discussion groups in Second Life, and you have office hours with the professor, but those office hours are conducted in Second Life. And the third tier is they just broadcast it on the web, and you can just sit and listen. And so they have 3 different tiers for every class. And this whole sense of now having office hours in Second Life, you know more about this than I do, but there's a lot of things that can be done with that notion. But it's a very simple sense of a 3-tier system. But let's move on, because those are kind of obvious, kind of evocative images. And I want to kind of look now, are there ways to think about this more deeply than just those kind of images might suggest. And what I want to say is that there may be something more fundamental at stake here. And that is, if you look at almost all ways of learning and education have been looked at, and most forms of pedagogy, is we start off training students about something. And that's where all the factual material, the conceptual material, and so on is taught. And after you spend, in my case, 4 years in undergraduate mathematics and 2 years in graduate mathematics, it was basically the end of the second year in graduate school that I started to learn what it mean to be a research mathematician. And that happened by accident. It happened because the famous professor I was studying under in a class got honestly stuck. And for the first time, I began to discover that mathematicians don't have divine insight, that they struggle as much as I was struggling, and I got to watch one of the world's great mathematicians struggle with a problem. And that was the first time I'd had any insight of what it actually mean to be a research mathematician. I spent 6 years learning about, and now was just starting to learn to be. And in fact, if you think about most education, we spend almost all our time learning about. And then when you go to do a graduate degree, often a doctorate degree, you start an apprenticeship program working with your mentor. And that's your first exposure, working shoulder to shoulder with that person and learning what did it mean to be a historian, what did it mean to be a writer, what did it mean to be a physicist, a mathematician, and so on and so forth. The question is, in today's world, might we think more about not just looking at how do you move from learning about to picking up the tacit practices of learning to be, but how might it be possible to start the other way? Could you actually start learning to be through some kind of joining a community of practice directly, a professional practice, an epistemic culture, if you wish. And then from that, when you get stuck, then you start learning about. And so there's going to be, of course, some kind of a spiral between learning about and learning to be. But the question is, could we invert this whole process? And this is very contrary to Western epistemology, or kind of most Western types of pedagogy. I want to look at some examples. Take, for example, the open source community. The open source community, best known starting here in Europe and Finland, having to do with the Linux open source community. Now, it is a community, but it is really a community of practice. And if you want to become a member of that community of practice, you learn how to join that community and pick up its sensibilities. So, for example, one of the things you do is you learn to write code so that it can be read by others. And you learn by building kind of very simple things first, and then the more and more expert you become, you take on bigger projects. And the better your projects are accepted by the community, the more heroic you become. And in fact, you start eventually to build serious social capital and identity. Now, what's curious about this, we are currently training 1 million students by having them join these open source communities of practice. They're not learning computer science, they're learning the practices of writing code. There's a little bit of a difference, but most of our kids today want to actually learn the practices of becoming a serious person in building complex systems, which things like Linux, Apache, and so on are. And so, without even thinking about it, and this was never meant in the design of this open source community, they were inventing on their own, without knowing it, a form of cognitive apprenticeship. These students were apprenticing not to a master, but they were apprenticing to a community of practice. And in fact, their learning, in fact, their motivation was to become and to join this community of practice. And through this process of joining, they were learning to be. They were not learning about, they were learning to be. Now, when they got stuck, they might back off and start learning a little bit more about. But they started by learning to be. So there's something interesting here about how you might invert this whole process. Let me choose a second example. This example also comes from Europe. This is the Faulkes telescope. This is a beautiful telescope. This telescope happens to be situated in Maui, and this telescope is completely robotically controlled. You do not need to be in that observatory to run this telescope. Now, believe it or not, the people that get to use this telescope are in England, and they're high school students. And high school students can actually run experiments. Any experiment they run on this telescope, they have to put up as a piece of open source. So not only do the images they take have to be opened up to the community, but then they have to be able to argue what did they learn from this image. And then what starts to happen is some professional astronomers often come in and start critiquing what they said they thought they saw in this particular image. So all of a sudden, amateurs, these students are amateurs. They're amateurs in a very interesting way. Amateur comes from the word amator. Amator from Latin means for love. They're doing this stuff for love. And what happens is professionals then interact with these amateurs, and what we're beginning to form is pro-ams, professional amateurs, so to speak, that are learning the practices of looking at images and interpreting images coming from the telescope. And in fact, in the U.S., we have 5 much smaller telescopes. And it turns out that not just students, but people that basically have stepped down from being professionals, starting with myself. And before I got here, actually, these I did 3 weeks ago, I grabbed 5 minutes on each one of these telescopes to take a set of images. And I set the experiment up, and then in the morning, I get up, and it's been emailed to me, the image. But it's been emailed to me in a format that then I can run all my own image processing software on it to enhance it. To give you some sense what is now possible, there's a 16-inch, this is much bigger, a 16-inch telescope that cost about $3,000 to make, which almost any amateur can make. Once you hook it up to being able to take images like from your digital camera, and then process it with the software that I have or other people have, suddenly the 16-inch telescope becomes better than the world's biggest, which is a 200-inch telescope. So this means that amateurs can all of a sudden start to do some amazing things. And you can imagine the excitement that a kid can make to make actually very original discoveries and then be interacting with professionals who can validate what they have found. And in fact, one of the most fundamental theorems or fundamental theories in physics actually got confirmed by 2 amateurs looking at being able to measure when the photons of a particular supernova actually hit the Earth, which enabled us to separate. We knew when neutrinos hit the Earth, we could then measure what the delay was to those photons, and that actually proved one of the most fundamental grand theories of physics, done by 2 amateurs. Blah, blah, blah. Let's consider things that most people find more interesting than astronomy. I, unfortunately, was an amateur astronomer, as you probably have guessed. Here is something which almost every kid I know loves, is looking at animals. And this is actually looking at the world of insects. And this is actually what I was talking about for a different reason here in Barcelona yesterday. This is a multi-million-dollar electron scanning microscope, which no high school and very few colleges and universities actually have. This device is on the internet. And so what you can do is you can submit students, these are high school students, samples of insect, and then have the scanning electron microscope make the measurements for you. You download the images back again. You actually set up the instrument, you set up the parameters of this microscope remotely, just like I did with the telescope. And you start to make your measurements. And again, very much in the spirit of open source. you put your measurements back up on the net that professionals can comment on, and so on and so forth. You get spectacular images. And in fact, this image here, behind me, is the end, the very tip of the fibers in a gecko. Now, it turns out that these fibers that I'm showing here are less than the wavelength of light. No matter how powerful your light microscope is, you can't see it. And this is the secret to how these little beasts run up the walls. And in fact, there's almost nothing more fascinating than understanding the physics of how these geckos work and then trying to build your own geckos that run up the walls. You're learning how to be kind of somebody that can investigate. There's some very fundamental things about in the animal world, or insect world, animal world here, how these beasts work. When I grew up, this was a complete mystery. Access to this tool starts to reveal all kinds of secrets that completely kind of animate an awful lot of kids that I know. But this is just the beginning. As you know, OpenCourseWare at MIT has realized that courseware itself is not enough. It's activities around courseware. So how do we start to put serious instrumentation, again, up on the net so that students anywhere can run experiments? And they have been developing a whole set of techniques to do this. This has to do with a pretty interesting heat exchanger that you start to run some pretty sophisticated experiments. And this high school students, college kids, can actually run these experiments themselves. And again, in the spirit of open source, experiments you do get put up for other people to look at. You have to defend your interpretations of them, and you begin to see how this kind of distributed community starts to kind of evolve. But we don't have to just look at science. Let's look at humanities. Here is a case of the Decameron web built around Boccaccio's famous Decameron novel, having to do with what Florence was hit by the Black Plague, and all the elites left the city, went up to the hills, and how they entertained themselves. This is probably the most famous novel in Italian literature. This site actually brings all the Italian scholars around the world together to put their own writings and interpretations of the Decameron novel. But not just the professionals. The graduate students and the undergraduates actually get to add information to this site. And in that process, they get critiqued. Could I get some water? Okay, good. Sorry. I will die, but I promise. And what happens here is that these students start to understand kind of the practices of scholarship. When I think about it a moment, almost everyone here has written dissertations of one form or another or published papers, but the processes of the review that you go through is a very closed process. And very few of us have ever kind of seen the processes of the review of papers in our particular field. Here they've opened up the entire process. So you begin to see kind of like the ways that scholars argue with each other. You begin to look into what are the practices of being an Italian scholar, and what are the kinds of arguments, and what gets shot down and what doesn't, and so on and so forth. Thank you. And so early on, unlike me having to wait till second or third year graduate school, you begin to get exposed to the fact that these scholars actually have serious arguments. And these are arguments in the past that have never been made visible, because basically these are the things that happen before papers get approved for publication. And so it's a very simple idea. But these kids, very early on, second year in college, begin to participate in joining this particular practice community if this is their interest. And there are hundreds of examples like this that I won't bore you with. But I want to suggest that something else may be going on. And this is a word which doesn't translate easily to Spanish, called tinkering. So let me propose kind of a definition of a tinkerer is a person who enjoys just messing around with stuff and fixing stuff and playing with stuff. It is a form of play. And in fact, today, a tremendous number of the people who are, for example, scientists and engineers, I actually started out life in my generation repairing radios, fixing motorcycles, and so on. And in that process of tinkering, you began to have a conversation with the world itself. You began to understand how mechanical systems work and how they don't work. You began to understand how electronics work and doesn't work. Do you have theoretical understanding? No. You have something else. You have gut understanding. You have something that is tacitly held that you're pretty much even consciously unaware of. But the kinds of experiences you pick up from this tinkering, I claim, set the foundations for being able to understand at a much more intuitive level the schooling you eventually get in engineering, physics, mathematics, and so on. And so I think there's something about how do we take this notion of tinkering seriously. Now, here is the catch. The ancients, myself, grew up at tinkering. But starting around 1980, tinkering stopped. Why did it stop? Well, it stopped in part because, take a watch. There's no way you can open this watch and figure out how it works. It's what I call, in a very fancy term, cognitively impenetrable. I'm a fanatic motorcyclist, an automobile enthusiast. You can't open up the hood of a car and any longer figure out how it works. It's cognitively impenetrable. If you happen to come from the state of California in the United States, where I happen to live, if you do figure it out, as I have, it's against the law to actually go in and change the software driving the timing ignitions of my car. Because by tinkering with that timing mechanisms, I can actually create a 30% increase of the horsepower of the car, but the emissions do get messed up. So it's against the law. And in fact, some of us have tinkered about how to get around that, and the law has tinkered about how we tinker, so they now know how to tell if I have been tinkering. So it's become a cat and dog game. But in the end, I lose, and you stop tinkering. But around 1995, it all changed again. Tinkering came back. And tinkering came back actually this time in a much more gender-neutral way. What happened? Well, we entered the digital world of remix. Entered the digital world of how do you tinker, build, remix, mashups, all kinds of things, starting with music, which again in some countries is illegal, film, images, and so on. And so a new culture started to get built. A culture basically that said no longer is there just the capitalistic system producing that I must consume, but rather we can all engage in the production and the consumption, and we can do this together. And this is the beginning of the digital world, is obviously the beginning of the Web 2.0 world that we all in this room kind of know about. But a very interesting thing starts to happen at this point. In a way to simplify a very complex topic, you might say up until fairly recently, kids defined themselves, and a lot of us in this room defined ourselves by I am what I wear. I am what I own. I am what I control. In this generation of kids growing up digital, it's not that way as much. It has as much to do now with I am what I have created or remixed and shared. And the things that I have shared, other people have picked up, mashed up, remixed, and so on and so forth. So identity And the construction of meaning often has to do with what I have now created that somebody else has picked up and done things with. It's quite a different dynamic for the creation of meaning, creation of identity. And if you start to understand this new form of identity and meaning construction, you begin to get an insight into learning to be. This is a fundamental form of learning to be. And it is what underlies almost all of the open source movements in the world today. And just think about it. If I were to had a lot more time, I'd take you into the amateur anime community to show you the incredible animes that are being created by kids actually in Europe from Japanese animes, which they have taken that film, the animes, and then kind of remixed them. But they're remixing them in a very special way. What they're doing is they're using their remixes to tell the backstory of the front story. So what you see is the front story. Then they, through acts of great imagination, they imagine what the backstory may be that created the front story. So a lot of these animes actually reflect a very deep form of reading, where basically they are kind of creatively filling in the white spaces to imagine what could have led to what you just observed. And so they use this to become kind of the fan communities that are filling in, through a very active form of creative reading, the backstory. And you can imagine the kinds of meaning that get created here, because those that create the most interesting backstories likewise become world famous, as you have here in Europe, in a set of people I know in London. But this also, in much simpler ways, what you see happening on YouTube. So I'm suggesting is we're beginning to see something happening in this Web 2.0 world that actually is maybe much more fundamental in terms of how meaning gets constructed, identity gets constructed, and how learning to be might be coming into play in new types of ways. So with all that, let me just flash through what is the bigger picture we're talking about here. Well, in one way, if you look at the famous long tail that Chris Anderson made so famous, what we find out, and although it's less so open university systems, that basically 80% of the revenue you make comes from 20% the courses, the big core courses. And in fact, unfortunately, especially if it's in a physical university, it's not quite the same with you guys here, is that 80% of the cost is actually creating these very niche courses down at the bottom of the long tail here. So in fact, the famous long tail distribution applies to teaching in a very serious economic way. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I want to suggest something else is happening. I want to suggest that there's a long tail in learning as opposed to a long tail in teaching. What I want to suggest is that out here in the long tail, there are thousands, no, hundreds of thousands of these very niche communities of practice, communities of interest that exist. And that these communities of practice, virtual communities of practice, are things that are such that if you happen to be passionately interested in topic X, you actually learn, you discover, and you learn how to join these communities. And through the process of joining, you are learning how to be. I want to claim that there's almost a mathematical theorem that any interest that any one of your students has ever had, there already exists an existing virtual community of practice. Now, in my particular case, take something very bizarre, like how do you rebuild a certain class of 911 Porsche engines for racing, which is about the nichiest thing you can imagine. There turns out to be hundreds of communities of practice out there that know almost everything there is to know about how I can tear apart an engine and rebuild this particular engine to have higher performance. It's a very simple example, but I never would have believed there would be so many already communities of practice out there doing this. And all I have to do is find one that is sympathetic to my interest. I join, and I'm basically engaged in an act of lifelong learning all of a sudden. But that was a bizarre example. If you're just in humanities, history, and so on and so forth, it is astounding what exists out there. So let's move on. Because what I want to suggest is there may be kind of a perfect storm developing that could completely transform how we might think about the kind of environment for learning. And let's look at this thing a moment. I've shown you examples of each one of these. OER stands for Open Education Resources. You guys are producing some of this material. Open University is producing some of this material. MIT, through OpenCourseWare, is producing some of this material. There are now literally thousands of courses that are basically open source courses on the web. That's the content. But there's a lot more to this game than content. If you look at the examples I just gave you of e-science, from the astronomy to the iLab of MIT, to the world, the animal world, the insect world, electron scanning microscopes, and so on and so forth, you're beginning to find that there's all kinds of e-science tools that are on the web and that can be accessed and used. Likewise for e-humanities, the Cameron Web is just the tip of the iceberg of the things that are existing. And now think more generally about the whole Web 2.0 movement that we're all familiar with, characterized by this whole notion of producing and consuming and producing, now a tight spiral developing there. And ask yourself, what happened if we decided to tie all these different things together? Not just content, no, but content, tools, and activities, wrapped together in certain types of communities of practice. Now we're moving into an era which we may actually have something quite new, something which Hewlett Foundation is beginning to take very seriously. If we could tie all these things together, could we start to build an open participatory learning infrastructure that not only ties this stuff together but closes the loop, so that basically the activities feeding on themselves, you actually understand, can you improve the course material? Take, for example, a course at MIT today. There's probably 1,000 different universities around the world that are using that material in all kinds of different cultures. Think what you can learn when you begin to see how this paragraph gets misinterpreted in a different type of a culture. If we close the loop through this kind of new type of infrastructure, we may be able to build a learning loop for ourselves to constantly be improving this material. Not improving a textbook every 2 or 3 years, but understanding almost on a day-by-day basis how what we're saying is getting misunderstood, how we can debug that misunderstanding, and so on and so forth. So I want to suggest what we're beginning to see is kind of the creation, by intertwining all these different things together, a new kind of an ecosystem, a learning kind of ecosystem that basically looks at knowledge creation, learning, and mentoring all tied together, which is quite a different notion of learning than being taught, if you wish. So what we really see is, do we have a form of active blending in the kind of Web 2.0 world, where now actually you're enabling kids at almost any age to actually start thinking about becoming kind of a practicing researcher, is actually doing and making stuff, tinkering with stuff, and how that feeds back into the learning cycle. So when we have this notion of kind of research and researching and learning kind of melding together here. And so let me just kind of close down. Thank you. I do want to be on that airplane. With a sense that, you know, for the 21st century, what we don't talk much about is how we're providing kind of the learning infrastructure in the ecosystem. It looks at how do you actually stimulate imagination. You know, everybody keeps talking about creativity. Well, I don't find creativity all that interesting because if you can't imagine something new, why would you ever try to build it? In fact, the real game is how do you imagine? How do you imagine a new world? And it's the act of imagination. Once you have that clear, it's not that hard to make it happen at some level. So I think we've maybe overplayed creativity and underplayed imagination. And then where do you get the inspiration to want to have an imagination? And how do these two things come together that really facilitate a form of innovation? Because these are the issues that even here, not even here, but maybe especially given why I'm here in Catalonia yesterday, is the whole question that preparing students for the 21st century, it has a lot to do with how do you enhance their imagination and how do you enhance their entrepreneurial, innovative spirit, and what are the foundations to make that possible. I want to end with almost a pun, and the pun is, if we can create a form of recreation which has to do with remix or recreation and productive inquiry, and the productive inquiry is when I want to build something and I get stuck. Well, when I get stuck today, I can go to the web and find out almost anything, or I can go to my open courseware material and find out almost anything, and so on and so forth. And so there's something very interesting that I think we're on the verge of seeing. Instead of passive entertainment, passive recreation, we're moving to a world in which more and more kids growing up digital today actually look at recreation, often talked about remix, mashups, and so on, as their form of entertainment. And if that's true, and if we're on the path to having that even become more true, then we may very well be on the path of creating a culture of learning. You know, a culture that actually does thrive on participatory lifelong learning in the ecosystems I was just talking about. And that then becomes its own sustainability model. So that's kind of a vision where we could go. I know I took too long. Thank you. So why don't we take like 10 minutes of questions as long as my taxi really is here? Okay, because you know, the gap this morning was 15 minutes late, so that's what we took a different cab. So I'm open to challenge, questions, explanations. Go ahead. Right. You know, I think um, the catch is not a question of knowledge. The catch is a question of attitude. Because in the model I'm talking about, the role of the professor is to become a mentor. But becoming a mentor in this 21st century age is often to have to admit, I don't know the answer. And can I work with you to find it? Because we're moving into the world which basically things are changing so fast that the notion of there being an authority that resides as the high priest of knowledge that stays there for long periods of time is increasingly questionable. And so most of us now have to come to understand that we don't understand most new things. And do we feel comfortable? And in fact, how did I personally discover open courseware? Because I had finished school some time ago. I have a gray beard for a reason. And I had to go on a TV program to be asked some bizarre questions about nuclear reactors. And so I had one day to do a crash course. And did I go calling up people? No. I went to my laptop And I first went to Google, I went to Wikipedia, and then I ended up at OpenCourseWare, and I opened up at OLI at CMU, and I pulled up all this material, and in one day I immersed myself in all the material I could find. And I had to be willing to kind of do that and admit that I didn't know. And then even on the TV program said, here's my opinion, but, I don't really know X and Y and Z. And so there's a sense of saying we got to get used to being mentors. And just like to me, the amazing, profound learning moment for me was Paul Helmholtz, a world famous mathematician, research mathematician, turning around and said, I don't know, but let's figure it out together. That was when I started really learning. We have to be willing to do that and to demonstrate that. And so it's not a question of having to learn new content necessarily. It's having to learn a new attitude. And that you don't have to go back to school for. That you build your own learning communities, even in this room, that says, hey, what does it really mean to be a mentor? What does it mean to illustrate the fact that you don't know? And, I don't know how, probably none of you are really trained in mathematics, but, for the first 4 years, I thought mathematicians had divine insight. I mean, it was kind of a priest of a new kind of religion, because they would show me these proofs. They're pristine, beautiful proofs. And I would say, oh, Father, you are so good. How could you possibly see that? I had no idea that mathematicians are sloppy. They are intuitive. They screw up unbelievably, and when they go to publish something, they get together and create this charade that this was obvious, when it was the furthest thing from obvious. So, I was taught under a charade, and it almost got me so discouraged. Once I understood that these guys didn't know what the fuck they were doing, and then I could start playing around with them and tinkering, got it. And that was the aha. But, Paul Helmholtz was so great, he had no hesitation to say, John, I don't know. And I didn't know that was a word he knew till that moment. But that's what we're talking about. And I think that, that is an attitudinal shift, not a shift in content. You have a question? Yeah. You just communicate. Wow, radical idea in teaching. It's a much deeper question than I first realized, because I've heard what you just said repeated at least half a dozen times yesterday with the minister. and and so it is an interesting question. How do you jumpstart this search? And that's one of the reasons why I brought up tinkering. And what I don't know is, especially in the world of music and things like this, don't you have a lot of kids doing remix? So one of the interesting questions is, how do you start building on the normal form of recreation in terms of remix musical playlists and so on and so forth, and start to build out on that? That's also why I used kind of the bug example, because there are very few kids that I don't know that aren't interested in these crawly things and how they work and so on and so forth. So, part of it is to capture their imagination, oh, look at that word, imagination. Pardon me, but on things that are inherently interesting to them, and you build on that. And that's why I keep talking about you start here, learning to be, in these amateur ways, and then eventually use that to rethink what does it mean to learn about. But believe me, it's easy for me to get up here and say that. I know. And by the way, it's not that much easier to talk about this in the States. And you might say the open courseware, of course, is used in the States, but don't forget it started in Europe. And I started in Finland, which is a little bit different than Europe. I understand that too. But nevertheless, this is becoming more dominant. And what we're talking about here in Catalonia is why you don't have more instruments on the net, so that students can play with these types of things, and maybe faculty can too. So I mean, there are a lot of questions that need to be asked here, but the spirit, I think, is a spirit for the 21st century, and I think it ties into starting with digital media so beautifully that I think from there one can kind of start to build up on it. I think, yeah, okay.